Some people think the worst thing that can happen is losing your home. They're wrong. The worst thing is driving back to the place where your memories should be and realizing someone erased them like they never existed. The smell of fresh concrete drifted through my open truck window nearly half a mile before I reached my property. At first, I figured somebody nearby was pouring a new driveway. Then I heard the low growl of diesel engines idling somewhere ahead, followed by the sharp metallic clank of heavy equipment shutting down for the evening. My fingers tightened around the steering wheel without me even noticing. Something felt wrong, deeply wrong. I'd been away for 9 days, overseeing a bridge inspection project outside Denver, and every mile home had been filled with the simple comfort of returning to the place my father built with his own hands. I could already picture the wraparound porch glowing beneath the sunset, the old white rocking chair facing the oak tree, and the brass porch light that had welcomed 3 generations of my family. Those images had carried me through every hotel room and every lonely highway between here and Colorado. As I turned onto my gravel road, the familiar crunch beneath my tires disappeared almost immediately. Instead, my truck rolled over compacted dirt covered in fresh tire tracks from bulldozers. Dust floated lazily through the warm Texas air. The mailbox stood exactly where it always had, leaning slightly to the left because my dad had refused to replace it after a storm 20 years ago. Behind it, there was nothing. I slammed on the brakes so hard my coffee spilled across the dashboard. My house was gone. Not damaged. Not burned. Not abandoned. Gone. The porch where my mother used to drink sweet tea every summer evening had vanished. The blue shutters my father painted every Memorial Day were nowhere to be seen. Even the stone chimney that had survived tornado warnings and hailstorms for decades had disappeared without leaving a single recognizable piece behind. All that remained was a wide rectangle of flattened earth surrounded by orange construction stakes fluttering in the breeze. My heartbeat pounded, louder than the diesel engines still rumbling across the property. The air carried the bitter smell of pulverized lumber mixed with wet cement, and tiny pieces of insulation drifted across the empty lot like snowflakes landing on a grave. Then I noticed the sign, bright white, freshly planted. Willow Creek Estates Community Expansion Phase 3. Future residents welcome. I climbed out of my truck without feeling my legs. Every step across the dirt felt unreal, like I had walked into someone else's nightmare. Near what used to be my front porch, a worker folded up a survey tripod and looked at me with genuine confusion. "Can I help you, sir?" he asked. I stared at the empty space where my front door should have been. "Yeah," I answered quietly. "I'm trying to figure out who demolished my house." Before he could answer, an expensive white SUV rolled slowly toward me through the dust, its chrome reflecting the setting sun. Behind the windshield sat a smiling woman wearing oversized sunglasses and the kind of confidence that only comes from believing you've already won. She lowered the window just enough to smile. "You must be Caleb Brooks," she said pleasantly. "I was wondering when you'd finally come home." I looked at her for several long seconds before I answered. Not because I was afraid, but because my mind was still trying to understand how an entire house could disappear in little more than a week. She kept smiling behind those oversized sunglasses as though she were welcoming a new neighbor instead of standing where my family's living room had existed for almost 40 years. "You should have checked your mail more often," she said, tapping a thick folder resting on the passenger seat. The association followed every required procedure. Then she rolled up her window and drove away slowly, leaving nothing behind except the faint scent of expensive perfume mixing with diesel exhaust. I stood there alone as the evening wind pushed loose dust across what had once been my front yard. My name is Caleb Brooks. I am 38 years old, and I have spent nearly 2 decades working as a civil engineer specializing in transportation infrastructure. Bridges, highways, flood control systems, those are the kinds of projects I help build. I have spent my career protecting structures that serve complete strangers. Yet somehow I came home to discover that I had failed to protect the one structure that mattered most. My father, Samuel Brooks, built this house almost entirely by himself after returning from military service. He was not a wealthy man. He worked 6 days a week repairing heavy equipment and spent nearly every Sunday framing walls, laying hardwood floors, wiring electrical outlets, and carefully measuring every beam twice before making a single cut. He used to tell me that shortcuts always collect interest later. That lesson stayed with me long after I became an engineer. My mother filled every room with warmth that no blueprint could ever capture. Every Thanksgiving, the smell of roasted turkey drifted through the hallway before sunrise. Every Christmas, she insisted the old grandfather clock be wound exactly at 6 o'clock in the evening because she believed the sound echoed differently during the holidays. Even after both of them were gone, I never changed a thing. The clock still stood beside the stone fireplace. My father's leather toolbox still rested on the workshop shelf with his initials carved into the handle. The porch swing still squeaked exactly twice every time someone sat down because he always joked that fixing it would erase its personality. People often asked why I never sold the property. Developers had made generous offers over the years, especially after Willow Creek Estates expanded toward my land. My answer never changed. You can replace a building. You cannot replace the memories attached to it. That house was where my father taught me how to read blueprints across the kitchen table. It was where my mother celebrated every promotion I ever earned with homemade peach cobbler. It was where I promised myself that no matter how successful life became, I would always have one place that reminded me who I really was. Standing on that empty lot, I closed my eyes and could almost hear the screen door slam against its frame, the wind rustling through the giant oak tree beside the porch, and the steady ticking of that grandfather clock floating through the hallway. Then I opened my eyes again. Silence. No porch. No oak tree. No clock. Only fresh survey stakes planted in perfectly straight lines by someone who clearly believed history could be measured with a tape measure and erased with a bulldozer. The first time I met Victoria Holloway, she smiled before she spoke, and somehow that made the conversation feel even colder. It happened almost 2 years before I stood on that empty lot. I had just finished repainting the porch railings when a white luxury sport utility vehicle stopped at the end of my driveway. She stepped out wearing spotless white sneakers that somehow stayed clean on my gravel road, carrying a welcome basket that looked more expensive than sincere. "Welcome to Willow Creek Estates," she said, although my family had lived there decades before the subdivision even existed. "I am Victoria Holloway, president of the Homeowners Association." I thanked her politely and explained that my property had never been part of the association. Her smile never disappeared. It simply became smaller, tighter, like someone gently closing a door. "Not yet," she replied. "Communities evolve." At first, the problem seemed almost harmless. Friendly invitations to attend association meetings. Glossy brochures describing exciting expansion plans. Letters suggesting that joining the community would improve property values and provide modern conveniences. Every few months another offer arrived to purchase my land. Each one offered more money than the last. Every time I declined, Victoria nodded politely and said she respected my decision. Then another letter would appear in my mailbox a few weeks later. Soon the friendliness disappeared. Survey crews began standing along my fence line, measuring distances without introducing themselves. Bright orange flags appeared near my property corners overnight and disappeared before sunrise. Construction drones occasionally hovered over my backyard long enough to photograph every inch of my land. Whenever I walked outside, someone from the association seemed to be driving past just a little too slowly. One Saturday morning, I found Victoria standing beside my mailbox, studying a large development map spread across the hood of her vehicle. She looked up as if she had been expecting me. "Your property interrupts the natural flow of the neighborhood," she said, pointing to a large green rectangle printed directly over my land. "Imagine children's playgrounds, walking trails, community gardens. Families would love this." I looked at the map for several seconds before answering. My house was not even labeled. It was simply empty space waiting to become something else. "That is because my house is already serving a family," I told her. "Mine." She folded the map carefully without saying another word. After that conversation, the notices started arriving more frequently. Complaints about overgrown grass, even though I mowed every weekend. Questions about a storage shed that had been standing legally for 20 years. Suggestions that my mailbox no longer matched neighborhood standards despite sitting entirely on private property outside their jurisdiction. None of the letters carried real legal authority, but each one felt like another small push against a door they hoped would eventually open. My neighbors quietly warned me that Victoria rarely accepted the word no. She had helped transform Willow Creek Estates into one of the fastest growing developments in the county, and local real estate companies praised her vision. What they admired as determination, I began recognizing as obsession. She was not interested in my house because it was valuable. She wanted it because I refused to sell it. Looking back now, standing where my living room once stood, I realized something that chilled me even more than the empty foundation. Victoria had never been trying to convince me. She had been patiently planning a future where my answer no longer mattered. The foreman shifted uncomfortably before answering my question. Sir, we were hired through a licensed demolition contractor. We received approved permits, signed work orders, and confirmation from the property owner. Property owner. Those two words echoed inside my head louder than the engines that had finally gone silent. Before I could respond, another worker quietly walked over carrying a clipboard covered in dust. He looked from me to the empty lot, then back to the paperwork in his hands. You really lived here? He asked. I nodded once. His expression changed immediately. That is not what we were told. He lowered his voice. They said the structure had been abandoned for years and that the owner had signed a redevelopment agreement. I held out my hand. Can I see the paperwork? He hesitated for only a second before handing me the clipboard. The first page showed a demolition authorization with an official-looking county seal. My address was correct. My name, however, was nowhere on the document. Instead, a corporate development company appeared as the authorized property representative. The signature at the bottom was completely unfamiliar. I looked up toward the fresh tire marks leading away from the property and felt something inside me settle into an uncomfortable calm. Engineers are trained to notice details before emotions. My eyes immediately found inconsistencies. The permit issue date fell on a Sunday when the county offices were closed. The survey reference number used an outdated formatting system the county had retired years earlier. Even the parcel description contained measurements that did not match the recorded boundary markers my father and I had verified together many years before. Someone had gone through considerable effort to make fake paperwork look real, but they had underestimated how closely I read technical documents. The workers began sharing pieces of the story they had been given. Victoria had visited the site personally several times during the previous week. She arrived with neatly organized folders, introduced herself as the association president, and confidently explained that the neglected structure had become a liability, delaying an approved neighborhood expansion. She assured everyone that every legal requirement had been satisfied. According to one equipment operator, she even pointed toward my house and laughed that nobody had stepped inside it for years. That was impossible. 9 days earlier, I had locked the front door myself, watered the flowers. Beside the porch, checked the thermostat, and driven to the airport before sunrise. The coffee mug I had forgotten beside the kitchen sink should still have been sitting there. My father's toolbox should still have been hanging on the workshop wall. The grandfather clock should have been ticking exactly as it had every day for decades. Instead, everything had been loaded into dump trucks because someone decided a false story sounded more profitable than the truth. As the sun dropped lower across the empty lot, one older operator removed his hard hat and quietly pointed toward the edge of the property. There is something else you should know, he said. Before demolition started, one of our guys questioned whether we should verify ownership again. She told him delays would cost the association hundreds of thousands of dollars and that every legal issue had already been handled by her attorneys. He paused before adding words that would stay with me long after the dust settled. She sounded less like someone following the law and more like someone trying to stay ahead of it. I did not sleep that night. Instead, I sat in a budget motel less than 10 miles from the place where my house had stood, spreading every document I still had across a small wooden desk beneath the hum of an aging air conditioner. My deed, property tax receipts, insurance records, utility bills. Every piece of paper confirmed the same simple fact. I own that land. Nobody had transferred it. Nobody had condemned it. Nobody had the legal right to touch it. Just after sunrise, I drove straight to the county sheriff's office, carrying a thick folder under one arm and hoping someone would immediately recognize how unbelievable the situation was. The deputy at the front desk listened carefully, asked thoughtful questions, and never once suggested I was exaggerating. When he finished reviewing my paperwork, he slowly pushed it back toward me with an apologetic expression. Mr. Brooks, this appears to be a civil dispute. Based on the permits they presented, This is probably going to require a court decision before we can determine whether criminal charges are appropriate. It was not the answer I wanted, but it was an honest one. From there, I drove to the county permitting office. The receptionist searched the permit number printed on the demolition authorization for nearly 10 minutes before frowning at her computer screen. She excused herself to speak with a supervisor, then returned carrying a different file than the one I expected. "This is strange," she admitted quietly. "I cannot locate the original digital record associated with the permit number on your paperwork." She could not explain why. She simply advised me to submit a formal records request. By lunchtime, I had already spoken with my insurance company, 2 local attorneys, and the county tax assessor. Every conversation ended the same way. Everyone agreed something looked unusual. Nobody was willing to make conclusions until they reviewed every document. Meanwhile, work continued on my property. Through the chain-link construction fence, I watched crews marking utility lines and unloading stacks of lumber for what appeared to be the beginning of a new neighborhood entrance. They were moving forward as though the past week could never be questioned. Then I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. The old mailbox still stood alone beside the road because it sat just outside the construction boundary. Its faded blue paint was chipped. One hinge squeaked whenever the wind caught the door. Inside, mixed among advertisements and utility statements, rested a certified letter stamped with the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association logo. It had arrived while I was away. According to the date printed across the top, it informed me that if I failed to respond within 10 days, the association would consider me to have abandoned my objections to redevelopment activities affecting the property. The envelope itself was postmarked only 4 days before demolition began. I had been hundreds of miles away supervising a bridge inspection when it arrived, making it impossible for me to read or answer it before the deadline they had created. I folded the letter carefully and placed it inside my folder. For the first time since returning home, my frustration gave way to something colder and far more useful. Engineers solve problems by following evidence, not emotions. Whoever organized this had built a timeline. The question was whether they had built one strong enough to survive when every date, every signature, every permit, and every mile I had traveled was examined side by side. The breakthrough arrived because of a habit my father drilled into me when I was 12 years old. He always said that paper could lie, but measurements rarely did. The next morning, I requested copies of every publicly available property map, subdivision filing, and survey connected to Willow Creek Estates. By noon, I was sitting inside the county records office surrounded by rolled blueprints, faded parcel maps, and digital survey files displayed across a public computer terminal. Most people would have seen a mountain of technical drawings. I saw a timeline waiting to be decoded. I compared my original deed with the latest subdivision expansion plans one line at a time. At first, everything appeared ordinary. Then one tiny detail stopped me cold. The legal description on the demolition paperwork referenced Lot 27, Section 4, but the coordinates attached to that description actually pointed several feet inside a completely different parcel. Whoever prepared the authorization had copied one property's identification number and paired it with another property's boundary measurements. It was a mistake so subtle that almost nobody outside surveying or engineering would notice it, but once I saw it, I could not unsee it. I asked the county clerk to retrieve archived revisions filed over the previous 18 months. She returned carrying an older survey that had never been replaced in the public archive. The difference between the two versions was almost invisible unless they were laid side by side. In the newer drawing, one boundary line had shifted just enough to make my front yard appear connected to the association's planned green space. The dimensions themselves did not add up. Someone had moved a line on paper without changing the surrounding measurements. Geometry does not work that way. Neither does property law. As I continued reviewing the files, another inconsistency surfaced. The engineering stamp displayed on the revised survey belonged to a licensed surveyor whose certification had expired months before the document's approval date. I immediately wrote down the license number and searched the state licensing database. My suspicion was confirmed. The expiration date came before the survey had supposedly been certified. Either someone had used an invalid professional stamp or someone had copied it onto a document after the fact. Neither possibility helped the association. Before leaving, I requested copies of every revision, every filing receipt, and every approval log connected to the expansion project. The clerk quietly mentioned that electronic records also preserve timestamps showing exactly when documents entered the county system. That single sentence felt like another missing puzzle piece falling into place. Dates could not argue. Computer logs did not care about expensive attorneys or confident speeches. As the printer slowly produced page after page, I organized everything into chronological order across the table. The certified letter that reached my mailbox too late. The questionable demolition authorization. The altered survey. The expired professional seal. The impossible permit date issued on a Sunday. Individually, each detail might be dismissed as an administrative mistake. Together, they formed a pattern too consistent to ignore. For the first time since I returned home, I stopped thinking about what I had lost and started thinking about what they had overlooked. They had erased a house, but in their rush to clear the land, they had left behind something far more permanent than bricks or lumber. They had left a paper trail, and every new document seemed to point in exactly the same direction. I hired an attorney the following morning, but I made one request before we discussed strategy. I do not want surprises, I told her. I want facts. Her name was Rebecca Lawson, and after reviewing the growing stack of documents across the conference table, she leaned back quietly before speaking. Caleb, if these records are authentic, we are not looking at one mistake. We are looking at a sequence. That was exactly what I had been thinking. We spent the next several days building a timeline instead of an argument. Every receipt, every electronic timestamp, every county filing, every photograph from my phone, and every travel record from my work assignment was placed in chronological order. My airline itinerary showed I had boarded a flight before sunrise 9 days earlier. Hotel invoices confirmed where I stayed each night. My employer provided project logs, security badge records, and inspection reports proving I was hundreds of miles away while every critical decision concerning my property was supposedly being approved. Rebecca smiled for the first time all week. They expected you to deny their story, she said. Instead, we are going to let their own documents contradict each other. We requested surveillance footage from nearby traffic cameras that overlooked the entrance to Willow Creek Estates. We contacted the demolition contractor, who voluntarily provided equipment logs showing exactly when every machine entered and exited the property. One operator agreed to provide a sworn statement describing the instructions he received before work began. The county records office produced electronic filing histories revealing the precise minute several permit revisions appeared in the system. Even the Postal Service confirmed the certified letter had reached my mailbox only after I had already left for Colorado. Piece by piece, the picture became impossible to ignore. Rebecca filed a civil lawsuit seeking damages for wrongful demolition, property loss, and every related cost. She also requested that the court immediately order all further construction on my land to stop until ownership issues were resolved. Within 48 hours, temporary work on the expansion project came to an abrupt halt. Fresh stacks of lumber remained untouched behind orange safety fencing, while survey flags fluttered in the wind exactly where they had been left. Victoria responded quickly through her attorneys. Their official position was simple. They insisted every action had been taken in good faith based on documents they believed were valid. They described the demolition as an unfortunate misunderstanding caused by administrative confusion. Rebecca slid their response across the table toward me and tapped one paragraph with her pen. "Read this carefully," she said. Buried in the middle was a sentence stating that the association had relied entirely upon independently verified property records. I looked up immediately. "But they already claimed they personally confirmed ownership before demolition," I replied. Rebecca nodded. "Exactly. They cannot have both." From that moment forward, we stopped chasing new evidence. We started preparing questions. Every witness would be asked about dates. Every filing would be compared with computer logs. Every survey would be measured against recorded property boundaries. We were not planning a dramatic courtroom confrontation. We were constructing something much more effective. We were building a case so carefully that the truth would emerge one document at a time, leaving no room for confident speeches or convenient explanations. As I closed the binder that evening, I realized the balance had quietly shifted. For weeks I had been reacting to what they had done. Now, for the first time since returning home, they were about to start reacting to what we could prove. The courtroom was quieter than I expected. There were no dramatic outbursts, no shocking confessions, and no theatrical speeches. Instead, there was the steady sound of paper turning, keyboards clicking, and the soft hum of the courtroom ventilation. As an engineer, I appreciated that. Structures do not fail because of one loud moment. They fail because of a series of small mistakes that finally become impossible to ignore. Rebecca stood before the judge with a single binder instead of several towering boxes. She had organized every document in the exact order events occurred. Nothing was exaggerated. Nothing was rushed. The truth would be allowed to introduce itself. Victoria arrived surrounded by attorneys. Wearing the same calm confidence I had seen the day she greeted me beside the empty lot. She still smiled politely at everyone who walked past. When the hearing began, her legal team repeated the same explanation. They had offered from the beginning. They insisted the association relied upon official records, believed every permit was valid, and acted in good faith while moving forward with an approved development project. Then Rebecca quietly asked the court for permission to display the timeline. The first document appeared on the courtroom screen. My airline boarding record. Next came hotel receipts, employer inspection logs, and project attendance records proving I had been working hundreds of miles away throughout the entire period when I was supposedly ignoring legal notices. Then came the certified mailing record showing the association's letter arrived after I had already left town. One by one, every carefully dated record eliminated another piece of their explanation. Rebecca never raised her voice. She simply asked each witness to confirm dates printed on their own documents. The demolition contractor confirmed Victoria personally assured the crew that ownership questions had already been resolved. A county employee confirmed the permit number shown on the demolition authorization did not match the archived electronic record. The licensed surveyor whose professional seal appeared on the revised map testified that his certification had already expired before the document's approval date, and that he had never authorized anyone to reuse his stamp. The courtroom grew noticeably quieter with every answer. Finally, Rebecca projected the two property surveys side by side. Even from the gallery, the altered boundary line was easy to see once she highlighted it in red. The dimensions surrounding it never changed, making the revision mathematically inconsistent with the recorded parcel description. The judge leaned forward and spent several minutes reviewing both drawings without speaking. Victoria's attorneys attempted to describe the discrepancy as a drafting oversight, but the computer filing history showed the revised survey had been uploaded only days before demolition, long after the original approved version had been archived. The timeline they had relied upon had become the evidence against them. After a brief recess, the judge returned with a written ruling. He found that the demolition had proceeded without lawful authority because the supporting property documentation contained material defects that should have halted the project before any work began. The court ordered all activity on my land to remain permanently suspended, directed the association to rebuild my residence to its documented pre-existing specifications under judicial supervision, and awarded me $12 million in compensatory damages, together with legal costs and additional relief permitted by law. The judge also ordered that the complete record be forwarded to the appropriate authorities for further review of the disputed filings. For the first time since I had driven onto that empty property, the silence surrounding me no longer felt like loss. It sounded like accountability. 1 year later, I turned onto the same gravel road at almost the exact time of day I had returned from Colorado, but everything felt different. The evening sunlight stretched across the property just as it always had, casting long shadows beneath the branches of the old oak tree. Yes, the oak tree was still there. During the rebuilding process, the court required every effort to preserve the parts of the property that had survived, and somehow that tree had endured through every survey marker, every construction fence, and every legal filing. Beside the road, the old blue mailbox still leaned slightly to the left. I could have replaced it 100 times over, but I never did. It had become more than a mailbox. It had become the one silent witness that never left. The rebuilt house stood exactly where my father had placed it decades earlier, reconstructed according to photographs, engineering records, insurance documentation, and the original architectural plans the court ordered everyone to follow. As I stepped onto the front porch, the familiar boards creaked softly beneath my boots. That sound stopped me for a moment because it felt like hearing an old friend's voice after years apart. Inside, the stone fireplace stood exactly where it belonged. The living room windows welcomed the same golden light every evening. Near the hallway, the grandfather clock had returned after specialists carefully restored the internal mechanism from pieces recovered before demolition debris was permanently discarded. At precisely 6 o'clock, it chimed through the house with the same deep tone my mother loved every holiday season. I closed my eyes and listened until the final note faded into silence. Some victories cannot replace what was lost, but they can remind you that truth still has a place to come home. The compensation ordered by the court allowed me to establish a scholarship in my parents' names for engineering and construction students who believed integrity mattered as much as technical skill. Every year, young men and women receive support to build bridges, roads, schools, and communities with the same values my father carried throughout his life. Rebecca occasionally calls to check on me, and every conversation ends the same way. She reminds me that evidence remains the strongest voice in any courtroom. I always tell her she was right from the beginning. We never won because we argued louder. We won because the facts never changed. As for Victoria Holloway, I rarely think about her anymore. The neighborhood eventually elected new leadership, new procedures were adopted, and property records throughout the county received additional review to prevent similar failures from happening again. That matters more to me than any personal satisfaction ever could. Justice is at its best when it protects the next family before another mistake is made. Sometimes visitors ask why I kept the old mailbox instead of buying a new one to match the rebuilt house. I simply smile and run my hand across the faded blue paint. It reminds me that appearances can disappear overnight, but the truth has a remarkable way of staying exactly where it belongs until someone is willing to notice it. I used to believe my parents' greatest gift was the house they built together. Now I understand it was something much stronger. They taught me that patience is not weakness, preparation is never wasted, and honesty leaves footprints that time cannot erase. Standing on that porch as the grandfather clock echoed through the hallway and the evening breeze rustled the leaves above me, I realized my home had never been defined by walls alone. It had always been built on something no bulldozer, no forged document, and no abuse of authority could ever remove. Justice is not loud. It is smart, patient, and inevitable.